A large portion of the Jewish nation has returned to its homeland, but the heart, soul, and mind of much of the Jewish nation are still in exile mode. This state of affairs must and will inevitably change. This is Torah Nation TV from Jerusalem, and we are speaking with the head of Machon Shilo, Rabbi David Bar-Hayim. Shalom, Rabbi Bar-Hayim.
Shalom.
The rabbi was recently interviewed on the issue of proper pronunciation of Hebrew. Some viewers have requested further clarification regarding the correct pronunciation of Hebrew. But first, can the rabbi relate to us, how did your interest in this subject first arise?
Well, let me begin at the beginning. From a young age, I was taught to read Hebrew, the age of probably 4, and I was taught both by my father and in school, the Jewish day school which I attended in Sydney, Australia in those days. And I was taught both by my father and the school. I was taught what is generally called nowadays Israeli pronunciation, which, as I will explain, is really Sephardi pronunciation with many parts and pieces missing and lacking. It's basically an Ashkenazi version of Sephardi pronunciation of Hebrew. And this Israeli pronunciation was what I knew from the earliest age until I came to Israel at the age of 16, almost 17 years old, when I began to study in yeshiva. After some months, I moved to a yeshiva called Yeshivat HaKotel in the old city of Jerusalem. I was 17 years old at the time, and I happened to sit on a regular basis on a certain bench in the Bet Midrash for Shaharit, for morning prayers, behind another student, an Israeli student, who happened to be Sephardi. And he used to daven, used to pray in a fairly audible fashion, and I heard how he was pronouncing the words of the tefillah, of the prayers. And I began to notice how he was pronouncing some of the words. And I became aware, slowly, that he was pronouncing certain letters or consonants of which I was completely unaware. I had never been taught that such consonants existed. I specifically refer to the ayin and the heth. I was taught, as every Israeli child, most Israeli children in most schools in Israel are taught, that there is no difference whatever between an aleph and an ayin. This is how it was pronounced. An ayin was pronounced just like an aleph. And similarly, I was taught that there was no difference between a chaf and a chet, as it was pronounced. It was exactly the same. Of course, there were many other letters that were exactly the same. Such as a kaf and a kof, which were supposedly pronounced exactly the same, and a vet and a vav, which were supposedly pronounced exactly the same, and a tet and a tav, etc. The list is quite long. None of this bothered me. It never occurred to me there was anything wrong with this method of pronunciation, even though if one thinks about it for a moment, it becomes readily apparent that there is something very wrong with this pronunciation, because it simply cannot be the case that we have all these, so to speak, spare and worthless and useless letters in the Hebrew language. It cannot be that a tet and a tav are really supposed to be the same, nor can it be the case that a vet and a vav are really the same, and so on. At any rate, I began to notice that this young student, who was of some Sephardi extraction, I'm not sure which Eidah, which particular group he came from, he was pronouncing very audibly the ayin, every ayin in the tefillah, and every heth. And I asked him, one day I simply got up the nerve and I asked him, what exactly are these letters, how do you pronounce them? He showed me more or less how he pronounces them. He spelled it out for me in my presence, in my ears, a few times, and I began to practice slowly, and actually I was surprised to discover that it took me only a few days to pick up this pronunciation of both of the ayin and the heth, and from that moment on, at least during tefillah, I made a point of pronouncing the ayin as an ayin should be pronounced, and not like an aleph, and pronouncing the heth not like a chaf. This became very rapidly. This became second nature to me, and I ceased thinking about it altogether. And this was how I pronounced Hebrew, based on this Sfaradi pronunciation, with the correct pronunciation of the ayin and the heth. This is how things were with me for many years, till approximately the age of 28, 29. Around that time I met a man entirely by chance, one would think, so it would appear. I happened to step into a certain shtibel, a certain shul, to pray mincha, and this gentleman happened to be there, and somehow we got talking. I do not remember how, frankly, and he introduced himself. His name was Benson Kohen, and he told me he had been born on the island of Jerba. Jerba is an island, a large island off the coast of Tunisia, where there happens to be one of the most ancient Jewish communities in the world. There is documented, the presence of the Jews on this island is documented going back 2,500 years. It's also well known that a very large number of the Jews in Jerba were Kohanim, as was this gentleman, Benson Kohen, and their pedigree could be traced back literally, quite literally, to the very earliest Kohanim in the Jewish people, back to Aharon HaKohen. This particular Jew, who happened to be a great Talmid Chachamim and a very great expert in dikduk, in Hebrew grammar and Hebrew language and pronunciation, his particular family had a written genealogy going back to Ezra HaSofer, which is roughly 2,400 plus years ago, which is an amazing thing in and of itself. At any rate, this gentleman introduced himself, and we got talking, and I went over to his home one day, and we spoke, and he showed me many things, and spoke and showed me how to pronounce different sounds, different consonants, and also vowels, which we'll get to in Hebrew. And he showed me some of the books that he had written on the subject. One book I have here is called Safaf Emet, when pronounced correctly, or otherwise one can pronounce it Safat Emet, or if one wishes Sfas Emes, as you choose. And this is a very thick book, as you can see, hundreds of pages long, which Rabbi Benson Kohen, Zichron Livracha, he unfortunately passed away at a relatively early age many years ago. This is a very fascinating and very exhaustive work on the subject of the correct pronunciation of the Hebrew language. He goes through every consonant and every vowel in the Hebrew language, and he brings literally sometimes 30 proofs for every single point and every claim that he makes, from a huge range of classical Hebrew sources, ranging from the earliest books dealing with Hebrew grammar, the earliest Hebrew grammarians, such as Rabbi Yonah ibn Janah and Rabbi Avraham ibn Ezra, etc., etc., and all the way up to the present time. And he also wrote, because this is a very lengthy work, as I just showed you, he also wrote a short version of this book, which gives you the gist of the matter, and that is this book here, which is called Kosht Imre Emeth. This is a short version, as you can see, of that longer book, which gives you the essentials, and without giving 30 proofs for everything, he gives only perhaps 5 or 6 or 7 proofs for every single point and every claim made. He taught me, Baruch Hashem, I was zoche to meet this gentleman, this very, very unique Talmid Chachamim. He taught me the true basis and the true traditions pertaining to the correct pronunciation of the Hebrew language.
Was Rabbi Benson HaKohen perhaps not pushing an agenda designed to justify the pronunciation of the Jewish community of Jerba and Sfaradim in general?
That is, in fact, a legitimate question, and the answer is very simple: absolutely not. I came to know Rav Benson Kohen, Zichron Livracha, rather well. I was at his home on a number of occasions. I spoke to him at great length, and he said to me explicitly on more than one occasion that the pronunciation of the Sephardim in general and the Jews of Jerba specifically is not correct on all its aspects. He took issue with many aspects of Sephardi and Jerbai pronunciation, and he said, I have no interest in trying to justify the Jews of my particular hometown or that part of the world from where I come. And he told me explicitly further that of all the Eidot, of all the ethnic groups within the Jewish people and the different traditions relating to pronunciation of Hebrew, he said to me explicitly more than once that the Temanim are without a doubt by far the closest to the original pronunciation of Hebrew. He did not claim that they were correct in every respect, in every regard of their pronunciation. But if I was to try to quantify it, his approach was that they were correct to about, shall we say, 80-85% of the time. There were certain issues and certain aspects of the pronunciation of the Temanim which are not perfect or not correct, which he speaks about in his book also quite openly. And therefore he was not pushing any agenda. He was being entirely objective, as anyone who reads these works of his will quickly discover. In conclusion, I'd like to mention that we find at least two other great Chachamim who demonstrated no particular interest or motive in terms of justifying the pronunciation that they had received or that most Jews in their part of the world were actually using, but rather they sought to discover and define the true pronunciation, the authentic pronunciation of Hebrew. First of all, I wish to mention a Teshuvah, halachic response written by Rav Cook. This appears in his collected response in the volume called Orah Mishpat, Siman Yod Zayin, and I quote. Rav Cook here is discussing the various pronunciations of Hebrew, and he writes, Ikar Yitron Mivta hu diyuko b'chiluk ha'othiyot v'nekudoth. ובזה המבטא הספרדי אינו מגיע גם למבטא האשכנזי. וקל וחומר שהמבטא התימני הוא המשובח מכולם, שמדקדק לחלק הרבה בין כל אות ותנועה בדיוק נמרס. What Rav Cook says here very simply is as follows, and really when one thinks about it is self-evident, that the clearest indication of pronunciation being correct and authentic, or more or less authentic and more or less correct, is the extent to which that particular tradition and pronunciation is able to distinguish between the various consonants, the othiyot, the letters of the Hebrew language, and the tenuot, the vowels of the Hebrew language. And Rav Cook points out that in some respects the Sephardi pronunciation is more correct than the Ashkenazi, but in many respects it is actually less correct because it does not distinguish, for example, between some of the vowels as the Ashkenazim do. And Rav Cook goes on to point out that the most correct pronunciation, without a doubt, when compared to the other Eidot, the other groups and communities in the Jewish world, by far the most correct is the pronunciation of the Temanim. Because he says, according to the pronunciation of the Temanim, each letter and each vowel has a distinct and clear pronunciation, which is not identical to the pronunciation of any other letter or any other vowel. And this is the true yardstick by which we can measure, says Rav Cook, the correctness of a given pronunciation. A very similar idea is mentioned by the Abet, who was approximately 200 years, or almost 200 years before Rav Cook. And in the 18th century, he writes in his famous Sidur Bet Yaakov, and I wish to quote that as well, at the beginning of his Sidur, the section called Sulam Bet El Sulam Gadol, at the very beginning he begins to speak about pronunciation. And he says, The Ashkenazim have a problem with their pronunciation. He himself, of course, was Ashkenazi. He says, "Lo kamo she'anu Ashkenazim osim b'kriyat tau refuya kesamech levoshtenu." He says, we the Ashkenazim have a very big problem. In fact, it's a great embarrassment, he says, that we pronounce the tau refuya, the letter tav without a dot in it, just as we do pronounce a samach, so it becomes a s. And this is a great and complete error, he says. Without a doubt, he says in fact this is a busha, a great embarrassment. On the other hand, he goes on to say, and I quote again briefly, he says, "Achen betnu'oth ashrenu utov halkenu lo kasfaradim she'enam mavdilim ben chames lefatah." He says when it comes to the vowels, on the other hand, we the Ashkenazim are superior to the Sfaradim because we distinguish between a patah and a kamet, which is a very basic and fundamental distinction in the Hebrew language. And here again we see that the Abet, who was an Ashkenazi by upbringing, by tradition, although he was also quite familiar with the Sephardi world, keep in mind his father had been the rabbi of the Sephardi community in Holland for a time, so he was quite familiar with the different traditions and different pronunciations that existed in his day amongst the Jews of Europe. The Abet was not trying to justify the Ashkenazi pronunciation over any other. He was searching for the truth, and therefore he says the Ashkenazim are more correct in these respects, and the Sfaradim are more correct in those respects. And this is precisely the point. We should aim to know, to learn, and to research and learn the truth, discover the truth, and to the limits of our ability, we should also endeavor to act upon that truth.
Thank you, Rabbi Bar-Hayim. We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.